Blood comes in, comes up with 3 kills. Looks for just a little bit more. The OT is going to start bleeding away. Prophet and Toby, the last 2 alive, trying to make it happen. The Barrage finds one, but Fearless gets rid of the Pharah. The Mercy goes down. The OT bleeds away. And it was so close, but still so far for the Seoul Dynasty. Shanghai Dragons take the series 3-2 in the end. They are the first team in the Overwatch League to lock themselves into.
Today I am going to talk about what I have called the tempo meta, the current meta in the Overwatch League 2020 Playoffs. I'm going to go over the comps that make up the tempo meta, discuss the teams, where their strengths are, and what we should be expecting from them, and my thoughts on who looks like the strongest, based on what we've seen heading into the Grand Finals. Before we get into the meat of the conversation, I want to explain why I call this the tempo meta, and that is because right now in OWL, there isn't one composition that is outright dominating, which is what we have historically seen. If you think back to Double Shield or Goats as recent examples, yes, there were a few variations on those comps, but it was always one core style. In contrast, what we have now are 3 compositions seeing a lot of play, and they've each got their own slight variations on top of that. And that is, of course, the Sombra Rush, Double Off Tank, and what I'll refer to as Long Range Dive, or just Dive. Now, the thing that dictates which of these comps is, in air quotes, the best in a given scenario usually comes down to the map being played. I say usually because obviously team strength is a big factor, but usually it comes down to the map being played, and the reason for that is each comp has a different tempo. So, for example, Sombra Rush is an incredibly high-tempo comp, very similar to old Goats, where the goal usually is to run as one unit, you're expending your resources quickly, the healing orb, the Sombra hack, and you're just trying to brute force the enemy front line. As such, you'll see it played a lot on high-tempo maps. With Double Off Tank, on the other hand, the goal is generally to slow down the game as much as possible, and that's because in Double Off Tank comps, you've got tons of heroes that are really good at finding picks by themselves, like the Roadhog, the Pharah, and the Ashe. So the more you can slow down the game, the more you can give those pick heroes time to find eliminations. Slowing the tempo is something Seoul Dynasty do especially well, and that's something I'll explore deeper a bit later. The third comp, the Long Range Dive, is what you've seen the Shock playing a lot of. Winston D.Va with the Mercy's End backline, and usually an Ashe with Tracer. Now, in terms of tempo, this comp sits somewhere in the middle of the previous 2, and generally you are split into different groups doing different things. The Ashe will play with the backline, and the Tracer with the front line. But I would say it is on the slower side, given that you want to create space and give time for your long-range damage, the Zen and the Ashe, to come through with either key picks or just enough pressure on the enemy front line that yours can clean up. So we've established that we have 3 different styles, and the primary factor after team strength that determines which you can play is tempo, the tempo of the map. So the next logical question you might have is, what defines map tempo? And the answer generally is one key thing: the length and number of sightlines. So to give an example of this, Gibraltar throughout most of the map has very long sightlines, lots of high ground, which is why you see teams like the San Francisco Shock go there to play their long-range dive compositions with the Zen and the Ashe. The sightlines and the amount of them mean that when a team is trying to play a fast tempo comp, where the goal is to make contact with the enemy team as fast as possible, it's very difficult just because of the length of the map, the length of those sightlines. It extends that time to contact, meaning as the rush team approaches, it's more likely players will get eliminated by Ashe headshots or Zen orbs, or they'll just get poked out. So in the context of this conversation, I consider Gibraltar to be a lower tempo map. An example of a higher tempo map is Lijiang Tower, probably the highest tempo map in the pool, with Control Center being the highest. And obviously that's because there aren't really any long sightlines, so that time to contact is very low. This is why you'll always see Fusion picking Li Jiang if they can, as it best enables that high-tempo Sombra rush they love playing so much. So, with all this established, a point I want to make early is that winning map 1 has never been more important than in this playoff tournament, and obviously winning the first map is beneficial in general. It's always good to have that map advantage, but right now, map advantage has never been more important, and that's because if you have map advantage, you're going to be able to play more maps that suit your preferred style, and each of the 4 teams definitely does have a preference. It's not like in previous metas where you'd both normally be playing the same comp, and it's more about the micro adaptations map to map. The maps in the current meta set pretty hard limitations sometimes as to what's really viable. Now, let's talk about the teams then, where their strengths currently lie, and who I think looks the strongest heading into the grand finals, based on what we've seen. So, before getting into this, I want to mention there are obviously a ton of caveats with trying to evaluate the teams for the grand finals, and most people do know them, but I have to go over them anyway because otherwise someone will bring it up. So, obviously, each team has had the better part of a month to develop since we last saw them. That's going to play a big factor. The NA teams have had to go through a 2-week quarantine, etc, etc. Most people already know this. So obviously, any conclusion about which team is favoured to win the grand finals is speculation based on evidence that is already outdated. But nevertheless, it's a fun conversation to have, so with that out of the way, let's talk about why I think the strongest team of the 4 going into the grand finals is the Philadelphia Fusion. Now, I know some people out there will immediately yell out that they lost 3-1 to the Shock in their recent match. To them I say, hold your horses. I am going to discuss that series at the end of the video, but for now I want to discuss how the teams have looked and why I think Fusion is the strongest. Starting with the Sombra Rush, I think just about everyone agrees at this point that Philadelphia currently look like the best Sombra Rush team, bar none. Their coordination is fantastic, they play fast, their macro game is excellent. Plenty of others have already performed deep analysis of the Fusion Sombra Rush, so I'm not going to go in depth right now, but that's something I want to establish early, is that widely we agree that they are the strongest at this style. Obviously, the Shock caught up a lot for their match recently, but I think most analysts would still put them ahead. Seoul obviously haven't touched Sombra Rush once, so we can get them out of the way really quick and talk about Shanghai. When we came into this tournament with the knowledge that Sombra Winston comps were going to be prevalent, I think just about everyone assumed it was going to be an instant win for Shanghai, reasonably so considering it's been their bread and butter basically all season. And while they've definitely looked like the strongest team in APAC at Sombra Rush, it's not to the dominant level that we all were expecting, and APAC as a whole feels like it's fallen behind NA a little bit in the chaos that is the current APAC meta. I think the reason for that is that Sombra Rush plays so differently to the Sombra Dive they were so good at. It's much more like GOATS, as I said at the beginning of the video, and it's also important to mention that they've rarely been playing Sombra Rush in a mirror match. In their match against New York, they faced a lot of Ashe compositions, and versus Seoul, they were obviously playing into a lot of double off tank. And naturally, it's much harder to run Sombra Rush into these styles, and that will colour our opinion of them a little bit. With that said, you can't deny how uncomfortable Fletcher looks individually on Reaper. It feels pretty similar to the Summer Showdown meta, where on the Genji, where he has to make the plays versus capitalizing on the space his team creates, he doesn't look as strong. And now that is also a team thing. Shanghai are very focused on empowering their tanks, but regardless, it is part of why they've looked a little less convincing, especially when running the rush into different comps, where I feel individual playmaking is a little more important. Moving on from the Dragons and onto the Shock, if you'd asked me before their match with the Philadelphia Fusion, I would have rated the Shock Sombra Rush as being worse than Florida's. The team coordination was very poor, much poorer than we've seen from the Shock in quite some time, which was surprising considering throughout the season high-tempo rush comps have been a strong suit for them. Now, naturally, this led most analysts to predict Fusion to win their recent matchup. However, the Shock, as I said earlier, really did massively level up during that week. Obviously, a big part as well was swapping out Rascal for Ans on the Sombra, who apparently has just evolved to the point as a player where he can just play whatever the team needs. After their match with the Fusion, I would now say the Shock have surpassed the Dragons in terms of their rush play, and while I still think Fusion have the edge, Shock are very close to a second, and I can definitely see why you'd argue for them to be number one. They played a really clean game on Volskaya in particular. The coordination was there, the macro game again, excellent, and on the defense where they played their dive, they showed an excellent understanding of what the win conditions of Sombra Rush are. They were making the right rotations, good target prioritization. Violet in particular on the Zen made Hisu's job of landing a half-decent EMP basically impossible. And that's something I'm going to harp on a few times, is not just how a team looks when they're playing a certain comp, but how they look playing against a certain comp with something else, because that to me is where you can really see how well a team truly understands the current state of the game and the various win conditions at play. Now that we've touched on the Sombra Rush a little bit, let's talk about one of the other core styles we've seen in this meta, the long-range dive, or just dive. Mostly used, obviously, by the San Francisco Shock. Now, of the three, I'd say this is probably the least important style to master because it's typically ran as a counter to double off tank. So if you're the better double off tank team, you just mirror that instead. And although it can be played against Sombra Rush, it is incredibly map dependent. Every comp in this meta is, but I'd say this one is the most so, as you really need those long sidelines. It is absolutely worth touching on though that there are a few maps in this pool, like Volskaya and Gibraltar, where it is hard to avoid this comp. Once again, I think it's North America that comes out on top. Starting with Fusion, I'd confidently say Fusion are the second best at this style behind the San Francisco Shock. This style puts a really heavy emphasis on the individual skill of players and timing. Everyone needs to be holding the right angles, not getting picked, hitting their own shots, and coordinating with their team to punish poor positioning. The Fusion have historically loved this kind of style. Shadow and Fury are on comfort heroes, Alarm gets to pop off on the Zen, they can bring Carpe in on the sniper role. Carpe, by the way, a player who I think people have forgotten just how ridiculous he's been this season. A lot of hype around Ans and Xe, and rightfully so, but Carpe has been a monster all season. With all this said, I don't think Fusion will ever be the best at this, and that's because it also requires a top tier Tracer player, and I mean a truly elite tier Tracer player who can consistently win duels, and honestly, only Shock and Seoul have what I consider to be that kind of Tracer player. I mean, I suppose Shanghai have DM, but I don't expect DM to be played much during this tournament. Fleda has obviously had a great season on Tracer, but in this dive style, I don't think he'd be as successful as Striker or Prophet. I'm sure this isn't the first time you've heard someone say this, but there's a greater importance of making your own plays right now versus just capitalizing on the space your team creates. So while he'd definitely be strong, don't misunderstand me, he'd have a responsibility to consistently win duels versus Prophet and Striker by himself over the course of a map, which I just can't see happening, to be honest. Seoul, once again, by the way, haven't touched this comp once because they're allergic to main tanks, the heroes, not the players. So that just leaves Shanghai to touch on, who, again, in my mind, fall behind the NA teams here. I think if Shanghai wants to run this comp against the Shock and the Fusion, they would have to bring DM in. However, they have so far this season really struggled when he's in the roster, and that's not because of his ability. The man is a monster. It's more because of what I said earlier, the fact that Shanghai is just so hardwired as a team to build around empowering their tanks, to take space, and capitalizing on the opportunities that space creates. They've never been one to really focus on enabling a DPS player. Lee Jae-gon also looks significantly weaker on the Mercy than the Lucio. Obviously, it's an inherently lower impact hero, and Lucio is what he's known for, but it is nevertheless another key individual weakness. And I know that just comparing players in terms of their raw ability on a hero, and not in the context of how they operate within a team, is somewhat reductive analysis, But I do think that individual ability is incredibly important in this kind of composition, particularly with the Ashe player. That leaves us then with the last and arguably most important composition of the three, double off tank. And this is where someone out there is going to mold, because I genuinely believe that the Philadelphia Fusion may actually be the best double off tank team in the Final Four. Now, I know that sounds insane initially, but hear me out. If I start with the shock, what we have seen is that they have to sub in Super if they want to play the double off tank comp to a high level, which immediately puts them at a slight disadvantage. And I do mean slight. Super obviously is a main tank, so if the team does need to swap out to, say, Sombra Rush, they still have that flexibility, and I do think Super's Winston is quite underrated. With that said, he is absolutely the weaker of the two shock main tanks when it comes to Winston, and I'd also say that he's a weaker Roadhog than Fearless, Gesture, and Shadow. And given that the other three teams can play this style with their default starting 6, this is probably one the Shock are going to want to avoid. I really think that they will steer as much as possible towards the other two compositions, particularly the dive. If we talk about Shanghai next, they've actually looked quite strong when they played double off tank, and they showed an excellent understanding of how to play it in the mirror against Seoul. With their hero selection and their positioning, you can argue Seoul are pound for pound the stronger team on the style, and yet Shanghai was still able to come out on top in the mirror, and I think that's really testament to their understanding. They didn't look quite as convincing to me as the Fusion, and I will get to why I think the Fusion are so strong at this. But I also really want to talk about Seoul. Now, Seoul is the team that I think most people would automatically have in their heads as the #1 double off tank team. However, not only do I believe they aren't the best, I think they might actually be the worst of the four. Now, again, hold on a second before you start calling me an r/competitive Overwatch user in the comments. Let's talk about this. So firstly, who have Seoul played against and won against playing this double off tank, which, as a reminder, is the only style they play. So first off, they swept both the Hangzhou Spark and the Guangzhou Charge 3-0. And let's be honest with ourselves, both those games were kind of a mess. Hangzhou in particular looked so incredibly lethargic and just didn't have any kind of read on the meta. Guangzhou, on the other hand, they had a better read, but I think even the Guangzhou players themselves have said their execution was very poor, and they did play a lot of weird stuff like Reaper Widow. And it was still a close series, like, it was 3-0, but if you go back and watch it, particularly the first two maps, a couple of fights go differently, and you're looking at a 3-2 scoreline. What really killed my faith in Seoul, however, was their match against Shanghai, which you might think is strange because Shanghai is the #1 team in APAC, and Seoul came closer to anyone at beating them. However, like with the rest of the games, I think if you take a closer look, you'll agree that the story this series tells is not one of the strength of Seoul, but actually of their weakness. If we take a high-level look at the series map by map, we'll start with Busan. We see Shanghai running the Sombra Rush, Seoul with their double off tank, their preferred setup with the Pharah and the D.Va, and Shanghai gets 2-0'd. Great if you're a Seoul fan, fine. Map 2, Kings Row, Shanghai's pick, a very close overtime finish, Shanghai wins out, but you're still happy as a Seoul fan. Obviously, they're favoured to win their map pick, and it was such a close one this. Hanamura, Shanghai gets absolutely steamrolled. This one isn't even close. Shanghai don't finish the map. So, right about now, based on what I've said, you're probably going, hang on, what part of any of this makes Seoul look like anything less than the best double off tank team? Well, it first starts with me adding a little caveat to that dominant map 3 win on Hanamura. And that is, I don't know what on God's green earth Shanghai were doing. On defense, they ran this Ashe Pharah mix with the Mercy, so two heroes, which in this meta, both really need a Mercy pocket, And then they transition to this Ashe Reaper crap, which just isn't a thing. And then on attack, they played Ashe Reaper Rush, which is something we've seen them do a couple times and also isn't a thing. So sure, Soul crushed them, but to be honest, if they didn't, it would have been a travesty. If we then move on to map 4, Havana, what happens here? Shanghai just decide to mirror Seoul and immediately beats them at their own game. It's by no means dominance, but this is supposed to be Seoul's speciality. This is the one thing they do. And not only do they lose, they actually look like they have a worse understanding of how the style works than Shanghai, running the Ana for almost the entire map while Shanghai runs the Zenyatta, and Seoul eventually concede and swap to Zen themselves. Listen, I know this is a heated debate, at least if Wolf's involved. Ana is fine when you are playing into rush comps. The bio nade can get insane value against a grouped up team, and the extra sustain for your tanks lets you slow down the tempo and give more time to find picks. But in the mirror, when both teams have the same pick potential, the damage and the Discord orb from the Zenyatta is so important, and it's almost always been that way. To round it off, on Lijiang Tower, after losing to Shanghai on Control Center, which is fair enough, it's the best rush map in the entire game right now, they lose again in the mirror, and Marvel even spends like the first 30 seconds of the map just swapping between 3 different off tanks because they aren't sure what to play. Listen, if as a team you want to exclusively focus on one style because it plays to your strengths, that's fine. Lord knows it's a lesson the Outlaws have needed to learn for 3 seasons. It wouldn't be an Owl video without a jab at a Texan team. But if you're going to lose mirroring that style to a team that switches to it halfway through the series because what they're doing isn't working, and on top of that you show just a worse understanding, like it's not even a skill mismatch, you just show a worse understanding, that is not a good sign. Now, before I move on to Fusion, I do want to say some good things about Seoul, because so far I've made them sound like the Owl team equivalent of a pigeon with one wing and a tumor. Seoul, I do think, have one area where they might just be the strongest team out of the 4 right now, and that is when they play double off tank against specifically rush comps. And the reason I say that is this team, as I said a couple times now, they are so incredibly good at slowing the tempo. Their preferred version of double off tank, based on what we've seen, is running with the D.Va, the Ashe, and the Pharah, and the Ana. And what the D.Va and the Ana in particular let you do is just extends the life of your front line so much. You've got the defense matrix from the D.Va, the healing output combined with the already high sustain of the Roadhog with Ana. It just makes it so hard for the rush team to find the kill. Not impossible, just very hard. You combine that with the disruption caused by Fitz on the Sombra in this case, and it just gives so much room for Prophet to just blow up absolutely everyone on Pharah, or for the picks to come through from Gesture. Finally then, we get to the Philadelphia Fusion, and why I think they may actually be the best team at this double off tank setup. Now, obviously, I'm going to talk about the Washington Justice game. Obviously, coming into this match, there was a really big fear that the Justice would knock them out of contention because of how strong they were and how little time the Fusion had to prepare following their loss to the Shock. And instead, Fusion came out and just pounded. So right now we're focusing on their double off tank play, so I will skip map 1, and I'm actually going to skip over map 2 just for a moment because there's something in particular I really want to break down with that. So, map 3, Volskaya Industries, Fusion, for the most part, just dismantle the Justice. Their point A capture was so fast, and just watching the way they set up, the slow rotation to the high ground, they get their off angles set up with this double sniper variation, and the individual skill just coming up from every player finding their shots. It was like a symphony. Their point B attack was quite slow, I will say, but it's well established at this point that double off tank compositions really struggle with closing out attack runs, especially on 2CP. They just don't have any like macro level big team wipe moves, so it's honestly a credit to them that they capped it all, especially considering how good the Justice are at their Volskaya Beholds in particular. So then if we look at the defense, Justice got smoked, and I won't focus too heavily on this part because a lot of it did come down to the fact that the Justice rammed the Pharah into double sniper for 4 minutes, because with Tuba they just can't mirror that, which is what you would typically look to do, and that's something any of the other 3 remaining teams could do. But it was nevertheless such an impressive show from the Fusion. But what really sold me was map 2, was Kings Row, and it was much closer than Volskaya, but I think it's here that Fusion really showed off an excellent understanding of just how this style works, particularly on point A. So on their point A attack, they take it nice and slow, they set up the off angles, and eventually their good position just lets them find picks almost for free. But it's their defense that I love with this Mei pick. No other team has done this, and I think it's so smart because the win condition of the double off tank when you're attacking point A is normally to slowly force the attackers off the high ground before going for the point capture, and that's just because the tanks take so much damage, obviously, if they just go straight to the point. Now the Mei combined with the Sigma makes that just totally impossible. There's only one way up, and the Sigma with the Mei will just completely shuts down any push. There is no chance you're getting up there. Now, it doesn't quite work on the first go, because the Justice are actually able to just essentially force the point. Why? I think because Carpe's on the Widowmaker. Now, a Mercy Pocketed Ash would be incredible here. The Ash lets you put out that consistent damage on the tanks, meaning they can't take space for free. You still have plenty of pick potential. The Widow can't really do that massive consistent damage output. You don't have the Dynamite, and there's just so much more time between shots. You've still got the same pick potential, but not so much on the tanks, who are the ones who are going to be taking that space on the point. So the Fusion's point A defense initially falls through. But what do they do in the overtime round? They swap Carpe over to the Ash, and they hold the point. They make that adaptation right away, and that's really what this series as a whole showed. It showed us the incredible adaptive ability of the Philadelphia Fusion, and just how strong this double off tank style can be for them. It's not the first time we've seen this level of adaptation from the Fusion in a series, but to do it in this scenario where they're going in against an opponent who is so strong against a style so opposite to what they were playing previously, it's just so impressive. It's not only a style they clearly have an excellent understanding of, it's one that again enables a lot of their players individually. Alarm on the Zen, Carpe on the Widow, Ivy was disgusting on Hanzo. I really think when you take a look at Seoul, Shanghai and Fusion map by map like this, it's really hard to argue against Fusion as being the strongest. Really then, that just leaves one last elephant in the room to go over before we summarize, and that is, one can argue all day about how the Fusion looked like the best team, but they lost 3-1 to the San Francisco Shock in their recent match. Now, I won't spend too much time on this, given that this video is already absurdly long, and I don't want to expend too much effort debating the opinions of people who say, Team A beat Team B, so Team A is unequivocally better. For me, the Fusion Shock series genuinely comes down to some very fixable mistakes on one round of Map 1, and I'll explain why Map 1 is so critical in this series, specifically in addition to what I said earlier about it just being more important in general right now. Even after the match, most people agree Fusion are the best Summer Rush team, so the expectation most had beforehand was that they would win Hybrid, meaning Shock would get to pick Volskaya on Map 3 where they can run their dive setup, and then Map 4, the pick is almost irrelevant because Shock can run the same style on, I think, basically any escort map. On Map 3 and 4, Shock were always going to have a very strong advantage, which meant that winning Map 1 and 2, the maps that better enable the rush style Fusion prefers, was vital. Then, in theory, you go to a Map 5 of Fusion's pick and close out the series the way it started. Obviously, that's just conjecture, but that's how at least I envisage this series going if Fusion were going to win it. The Fusion, however, didn't win map 1 obviously, and as I said, I really think it comes down to one round, and that one round is Lijiang Night Market, where the Fusion just had so many opportunities to retake and completely botched it, to be honest. Now, full credit to the Shock. They played an excellent defense to bring that round back from quite a large deficit. But if you go back and watch that round, there are some giga throws from Fusion. I won't analyze it in depth here, because I've already said this video is ridiculously long. But really, go back, watch it, and you'll see some egregious stuff. I think the worst example is Fusion getting 0 value from a grab and a blizzard in the same fight. This is just the kind of mistakes I don't think you'll see any of the top teams make twice. In summary then, I think the key takeaway most people can agree on heading into the Grand Finals is that the North American teams do look to be ahead of the APAC teams for the most part. Whether or not you agree with my viewpoint that Fusion looked the strongest is another matter. But I do want to make clear that even with that statement, I think the Shock are a very close second. The APAC side of things have undoubtedly left us all a little wanting in terms of their play. That said, we obviously have a very big break leading into the Grand Finals, and as I said earlier, both NA teams have to go through quarantine, so realistically, anything could happen, and anyone stating anything will happen with 100% certainty is clueless, to be perfectly honest. Nevertheless, this was a fun topic to discuss, and if you've somehow made it this far, thank you for sticking around for the whole thing. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I do want to try and make more discussions and analysis videos going forward, though not half as long as this one hopefully, but it's really hard to find the time with life commitments. Everyone knows how it is, especially if you try and do what I do, where you try and find the clips to match what you're talking about. I don't know, we'll see. Regardless, thank you so much for watching, have a great day, hopefully I'll see you next time.
God's already dead. This is disaster. Pulse bomb, self-destruct, all launched in. Stitch is going to fall as well. 10 seconds for the Justice. They've got one hope left, and it's going to be Tuba's barrage. The Resurrection can't come through in time, and Janu loses his mech. The Dragon Strike in the air, and Tuba goes down to aim alarm even. The Transcendence is going to come out as well, and this is going to be it. The fairy tale story for the Justice. The 12th seed is going to end right here. The Fusion knocked them out in a 3-0 fashion. And they booked their ticket to Korea.